It's been really interesting thus far, so I'm really looking forward to this panel in particular. Our presenter for this afternoon's session is Professor Daniel Malan. He's an assistant professor of business ethics at Trinity Business School at Trinity College in Dublin. He is also the co-chair of the B20 Task Force on Integrity and Compliance, and a member of the Global Future Council on Transparency and Anti-Corruption of the World Economic Forum. He's consulted to the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, International Finance Corporation, as well as various large corporations in 41 countries. Professor Malan, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you because I'm sure the rest of the panel and the rest of our guests are excited to hear more about moral money and the future role of the company. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the moderator and also to the chairman for these introductory remarks. I do have prepared notes that I'm going to stick to, so my apologies if it's going to sound a bit formal at times, but in that way, at least I make sure that I share everything with you that I planned to do. And I would also be very happy to share the notes with you after the conference. I'm also just going to time myself. I should speak for about 20 minutes, and hopefully after that we'll have enough time for discussion. Again, thanks very much for the invitation to address the conference. And I wonder how many of you read the topic for the session and said, I know exactly what he's going to talk about. And I have to confess immediately that this wasn't the case with me. So this topic was given to me, and after having given it some thought, I decided that it might be best to try and answer it like an exam question that I might set for my students. So I'll try to unpack the question first, then try to answer it, and then try to explain to you why my answer is not sufficient. Of course, the last part is usually what the lecturer will do to the student, not the other way around. But let me start with a few very basic working definitions and interpretations, and I'll come back to these in more detail. The future role of a company, I think, refers to the ongoing discussions about the purpose of business and the best approach to value creation. Moral money refers to responsible investment with a specific focus on environmental, social, and governance, or ESG issues. And for corporate governance for this session, I will use the Cadbury definition, the system by which companies are directed and controlled. The question itself is a loaded one. Does moral money now lead corporate governance? Although it might seem as if a simple yes or no is required, that clearly is not the case, because there are a few more fundamental questions that should be answered. Firstly, what should the role of investors be in corporate governance? Secondly, what is the current involvement of investors in corporate governance? And finally, if we should conclude that moral money does indeed lead corporate governance, is that a good or a bad thing? So this is clearly not a simple empirical question. In his opening address earlier today, Professor Garrett referred to the Business Roundtable statement about the purpose of the corporation. And it is indeed significant, I think, that so many CEOs of large corporations have confirmed their belief that, and I quote, each of our stakeholders is essential and we commit to deliver value to all of them. I would also at the same time like to highlight the academic contribution by Professor Tom Donaldson and Professor Jim Walsh in their 2015 article Towards a Theory of Business. They make the valid point that there is an important distinction between what value is for an individual company and what value is for business in general. They illustrate this by inviting the reader to complete the following riddle. Law is to justice as medicine is to health, as business is to what? I'm sure that you've all immediately thought of one or two answers or words that could fill that gap. Their theoretical answer is optimized collective value. And they also offer the more practitioner-friendly translation of prosperity. Prosperity, rather than shareholder wealth, I think captures this idea or the concept of collective value, which is perfectly aligned with the Business Roundtable's commitment to deliver value to all stakeholders. The current use of the term moral money seems to have gained traction through the Financial Times with their new initiative that explores the fast-growing international shift towards what they call ethical, sustainable, and responsible investing. I think the term moral money is both useful, but also problematic. It's useful because it captures the sense of value-based decision-making, specifically with reference to the investment community. But it is problematic because it adds yet another concept to an already cluttered nomenclature. Conscious capitalism was mentioned earlier, connected capitalism, inclusive capitalism, and also because it suggests or implies the existence of immoral money. This distinction between the two, I don't think is very useful. If it's not part of our definition of moral money, then it must be immoral money. In his latest book, The Power of And, the father of stakeholder theory, Ed Freeman warns us against this type of what he calls saints or sinners thinking. The world is complex and human beings are complex. I'm certainly not arguing in favor of moral relativism, where in Rome simply do as the Romans do, but I do suggest that we should take the context seriously when we subject the actions of companies or individuals to moral scrutiny. So let us rather, for the moment, use the umbrella term of responsible investment. The United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment Initiative defines responsible investment as, and I quote, a strategy and practice to incorporate environmental, social, and governance, ESG factors in investment decisions and active ownership. The 6 principles of the United Nations Principles, the PRI, cover a commitment to incorporate ESG issues into investment analysis, decision-making, ownership policies and practices, to seek appropriate, and also to seek appropriate disclosure on ESG issues by the entities in which they invest. In order to answer the question whether moral money or responsible investment now leads corporate governance, we need to look at recent developments and put a few facts and a few numbers on the table. The FT mentions the number of 23 trillion US dollars invested according to ESG principles. The UNPRI has more than 3,000 signatories that support the principles that I've just mentioned. And recently, the World Bank published a guide for sovereign debt managers on how to engage with investors on ESG issues. According to the World Bank, and I quote, investors in general, whether investing intentionally for impact or not, recognize that they can play an important role in tackling urgent issues and that the investments can contribute to achieving key sustainability goals, end quote. I think the use of the words whether they invest for impact or not is significant because it addresses the question of purpose again. In broad terms, this can be captured in the moral case versus business case dichotomy. Do we do this because we'll make more money, or do we do it because it's the right thing to do? As long as these two are aligned, there is no problem. That is the enlightened self-interest argument, but we know that that is not always the case. In terms of metrics and reporting, the World Economic Forum, in collaboration with the Big Four accounting firms, also recently published a white paper in which they propose a set of common metrics for sustainable value creation. Essentially, this is a consolidated set of metrics relying on existing standards such as the Global Reporting Initiative, International Integrated Reporting Council, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and many others, but using yet another framework of 4 pillars: governance, planet, people, and prosperity. This proliferation of metrics is undesirable, but perhaps unavoidable, and we should prepare ourselves for ongoing future adjustments based on new context and new perspectives on materiality. These were my basic comments on reporting that I also shared yesterday with the panel, but then a few hours after I sent my comments yesterday, came the announcement of the merger between the International Integrated Reporting Council, the IRC, and SASB, the Accounting Standards Board, into the newly created Value Reporting Foundation. This caught many people by surprise, including myself. And indeed, the future adjustments that I predicted came a bit sooner than I expected. This merger, I believe, could be one of the most significant steps ever in the corporate reporting landscape, or it could cause further fragmentation in the name of integration. If the merger is a serious attempt at consolidation, it will clarify some of the conceptual clutter and simplify the maze of metrics that producers and consumers of corporate reports have struggled with for decades. But if this is simply another strategic coalition to ensure the continued existence of both, it will confuse existing supporters and alienate possible new converts. The merger is presented as a response to calls from global investors and corporations such as BlackRock to simplify the corporate reporting landscape. So far, so good. But to announce the creation of a merger, a new foundation, and at the same time confirm that both the IR framework and SASB standards will remain complementary tools should ring an alarm bell or two. It reminds me of the reference to a nested ecosystem made in the statement of intent to work towards comprehensive reporting, which was published only a few months ago in September this year. This statement summarizes alignment discussions between 5 sustainability and integrated reporting organizations. In addition to the IRC and SASB, participants also included the CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, and the Global Reporting Initiative, or the GRI. I believe that the corporate reporting space does need real consolidation and integration. But quite frankly, we've run out of time for alignment only. We have slowly and painstakingly moved from global reporting, that's the GRI founded in 1997, through integrated reporting, the IRC in 2010, to now arrive at value reporting with the Value Reporting Foundation in 2020. In response to the new foundation, GRI Chairman Eric Hespenheide said yesterday, GRI, and I quote, GRI looks forward to working closely with the Value Reporting Foundation to continue progress towards the vision of a single coherent system of corporate disclosure. We've heard this one before. If this vision is shared by all stakeholders, why did the GRI not participate in the merger? Unless we start to see the disappearance of previous standards and organizations as part of the consolidation and simplification process, the cynics will be justified in viewing the use of terms such as nested ecosystem as newspeak for turf protection and job preservation. While simplification of the corporate reporting landscape is crucial, the need for a more sophisticated understanding of the complex landscape itself should also not be negated. At the moment, the IRC uses the 6 capitals model. That's financial, manufactured, intellectual, human, social and relationship, and natural capital. And SASB uses the 5 dimensions of sustainability: environment, social capital, human capital, number 4, business model and innovation, and number 5, leadership and governance. However, ESG, environmental, social, and governance, remain the most widely used framework in the global investor community. And I believe that the 6 capitals model is probably the closest to Professor Garrett's recommendation of EESG that he mentioned earlier. But whatever the nomenclature, stakeholders if they don't understand the concepts, the metrics will not help. The most recent Edelman Investor Trust Report, a survey of leading institutional investors, is a case in point. They ask the following: do investors really care about environmental, social, and governance in the middle of a global pandemic, or has the focus shifted back to the bottom line? I find this question astounding. They might as well have asked the following: do investors really care about ESG in the middle of a climate crisis, or has the focus shifted back to the bottom line? One of the findings of the survey, according to Edelman, is that, and I quote, investors have temporarily deprioritized ESG due to COVID-19. The basic failure to identify a global health pandemic as an ESG issue should be of grave concern. In addition to the pandemic, global markets have been impacted by ESG issues like financial crises, terror attacks, large-scale corporate fraud over many years. But there are still too many analysts that fail to acknowledge these major movements in the markets as having been caused by ESG issues. They continue to focus their attention on the relatively insignificant discrepancies between the performance of all share indices and responsible investment portfolios. It is fair to say that there is more pressure now than ever before from investors on companies to act responsibly and to measure and report to all stakeholders using some form of an ESG framework. Yesterday's announcement, driven largely by investors, is a good example. With the boards of directors of these companies being the custodians of corporate governance and the vast majority of them having been appointed by the shareholders, one could therefore claim tentatively that moral money is indeed leading corporate governance. But let me take one step back here and make a comment about the relationship between shareholders, boards, and executives. It seems to me that much of the decades-old debate about shareholder primacy was really about the underlying ethical issues. The argument about who should lead or be in control is often informed by assumptions about the ethical intentions of those who are involved. When executives are bullied into short-term decisions that benefit greedy shareholders, we argue that the power of shareholders should be curtailed. But when executives are pressured into the adoption of long-term sustainable behavior, rather than serving their own short-term and often greedy needs, we applaud the power of shareholders, especially the responsible investors with institutional muscle. To be clear, this has to do with an assessment of the behavior and powers of shareholders, of directors, and of executives, and has nothing to do with the legal argument of who owns the corporation, which I will not discuss here. To fully comprehend the complexity of leadership in governance, it is important, I believe, to look at Professor Garrett's proposal. Once again, not going to discuss that in detail, for a rational, integrated system of effective corporate governance that combines the needs and performance assessment of directors, owners, legislators, and regulators under the agreed process of public oversight. I fully support this system. It would be up to each of these stakeholder groups to bring their specific issues to the table and to discuss it in an honest and transparent way. To conclude, and in response to the original questions, does moral money lead corporate governance? And if so, is it good? I offer the very unsatisfactory answers, hopefully, and it depends. Clearly, if the ones that claim to get it, like the UNPRI, Edelman, and the FT, are struggling to deal with the complexities of what the World Economic Forum has termed a multi-conceptual, multipolar world, we have to accept that. But at least they are working on this, and the numbers seem to be growing all the time. Hence my tentative answer that hopefully they are leading. Whether this is a good thing will ultimately depend on their behavior. This will unfold over time, and no doubt some will get it right and some will get it wrong. The journey towards the bright pyramid that Professor Garrett referred to will not be an easy one. But one of the things that we have learned from the COVID-19 pandemic is that major change and rapid change are not incompatible. I believe that should also be our aim in the field of corporate governance, and moral money or responsible investors have a huge contribution to make. Thank you very much.
You need to unmute, Shelly.
You're on mute. There we go.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Malan. Like a good professor, you've provoked a lot of questions for me. But before I start to bombard you with questions, I'm going to invite panelists, Alison, Dillon, Kibirige, to make a few comments and to give us a bit of her insights. Alison, let me just get her profile. Alison is a global expert and author on corporate governance, ethics, CSR, sustainability, risk management. She's worked in Africa, Asia, South America, Eastern Europe, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. She's worked across all three sectors, private, state-owned, and not-for-profit. I'm going to invite Alison to give us some comments.
Thank you very much, Shelley, and thank you, Kamla, for inviting me to join the panel today. I'm going to look at the topic from a slightly different perspective, because I'm going to look at it from the company or organization perspective and how they might respond to and this change that we're hopefully going to be seeing in the way that investors are approaching the organizations that they are investing in. So the first thing an organization's board needs to do is to determine its strategic approach and ambition level in response to investors' requirements as far as ESG is concerned. They obviously do this in the same way that they would do their other strategic planning, through analysing market trends, the regulatory landscape, tracking and predicting the ESG expectations of their current and potential investors, and conducting peer reviews and benchmarking of other organisations. Many organisations are using the UN Social Development Goals as a benchmark, and organisations will not be able to meet all of these, Sustainable Development Goals, so will need to be selective and explain why they have made the choices they have. Organisations, as we know, are unique and therefore have different risk and operational profiles, and this will determine the choices they make as far as their ESG activities. So if we look at one sector, which is extraction, we have two examples. One is BP, which one of its main aims is zero emissions, whereas if you compare that to Rio Tinto, its focus appears to be on gender balance. So they're both picking different focuses for their ESG activities. This analysis should identify the gaps between the organisation's current and desired approaches to ESG. Management would then prepare a roadmap aimed at closing the gaps. Action plans can then be created and integrated into the organisation's strategy. And I think it's very important when you're looking at ESG from the organisation's perspective that you don't see it as an add-on to what you're doing and your operational activities. It does need to be fully integrated into what you're doing. The board should then review and challenge the integrity of the proposed actions and develop key performance indicators to monitor the implementation of the actions. The board should also consider if changes are needed to the governance structure of the organisation. Some organisations have already put in place committees at board level focusing on aspects of ESG. Unilever has had a corporate social responsibility committee probably now for about 20 years or more. BP more recently has had a safety, environment and security assurance committee. So these committees are coming into play. We've seen as a result of the pandemic, organisations putting in place supply chain and different stakeholder committees. So I think boards are starting to look at this area and trying to focus in and review things in greater detail. The board should also consider what policy and operational procedures should be amended to ensure that the ESG principles are incorporated in the way that the business is conducted. So performance appraisals throughout the organisation should include metrics relating to ESG practices within the organisation. Management and employees should be educated and trained in the ESG behaviours expected from them. Once the ESG practices have been implemented within the organisation needs to tell investors about them so that they get the benefit from them. And as Daniel has just been talking about, there are a plethora of standards for disclosing and measuring ESG performance. And I'm not going to go into those as Daniel talked about many of them. I think what companies need to think about is the the reporting needs and requirements for data collection for the standards that they have chosen that they're going to be following. This is because the traditional data collection and reporting systems for financial information will not be adequate to report on ESG. So new systems and reporting are going to have to be put in place. The board should review the organisation's reporting on ESG to ensure it's of a high quality and meets the expectations of the investors. Many organisations, I know IKEA is one of them, get third-party verification on the achievement of their ESG activities to ensure that the promises that they have made have been honoured. Investors and other stakeholders will be watching out for what's called greenwashing, and this is where organisations attract investors with promises of ESG activities but do not honour them. With that, I'll pass back to Shelly, and obviously I'm happy to take questions when we open up for the question session. So thank you.
Thank you, Alison. That was good, very interesting perspective, looking at the perspective of the company, trying to attract investors and what they have to take on board in adopting ESG principles. Our other panelist, Mr. Richard Rambaran, has sent his apologies. He won't be able to make it to this session. So we are going to pass the baton, as it were, to Mr. Mariano Browne, who is the chairman of management consultancy firm Alida Management Services Company Limited. He's a director of several companies and therefore brings a wealth of corporate governance experience. He's also a chartered accountant by profession and was a former government minister, holding 2 cabinet portfolios, minister in the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Trade. Mr. Browne is currently the CEO of Arthur Lockjack Graduate School of Business. Mariano, do you have some comments? We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say a few words. And,
your audio is a little bit low, Mariano. Let me do a quick check on it.
Yeah, I'm not certain why. Hold on.
Okay, let's try that again.
Is this better?
Oh yes, much better. Good. Thank you.
All right. I took off the headphones. All right. Well, today I'd like to take the position. I'd like to speak from the issue of perhaps from the general public. Whilst we speak in large measure about the role of governance and corporations, I want to widen it a little bit to the issue of stakeholders, particularly as I'm coming from a country which has built its reputation and its economic background and strength largely on the basis of foreign direct investment, which means that the companies which have the largest motive power in the domestic market are in a sense foreign. And therefore, when we talk, it's all well and good to talk about reporting guidelines, principles, and so on and so forth. The reality is that those reports are being presented in a different jurisdiction altogether from the one in which they're likely to have the greatest impact. And that's the domestic jurisdiction. So let me then take on the voice, therefore, of all those countries in which some of our larger multinationals, particularly in the extractive and energy sector, operate. Because those principles are largely in respect of home governance, if you will, the shareholders and stakeholders in their societies, as distinct from the stakeholders in the societies in which we live in. Now, that's particularly important because largely that's a voice that is unheard. Not only is it unheard, it's a voice in which we really have no real direct influence, except in a negative way, with respect to how these principles operate. So whilst I accept that we need to have them, I also take the position that they need to be more accountable. One could argue that from a corporate governance perspective, the stakeholders in, if you want, remote jurisdictions, the jurisdictions in which they operate, have the least influence on those standards, on the operation of those standards, because they're really not in control and have very few levers of power, very few levers by which to to basically speak truth to power. And how does the operation of those companies affect us? That's the first point. The second point is that in large measure, the reporting requirements, as all reporting requirements are very broad, very largely conceptual, and don't necessarily speak to the issue of results. How are we affected? And to speak to the issue of results brings us into another perspective, another position once again. That's the issue of measurement, not only in terms of what the company is doing, but measurement in individual societies in which are being affected. Now, that also speaks to a certain type of regulatory environment. Now, regulation in terms of accounting standards and so on is something that's fairly remote. And generally speaking, has to do with the governance aspects in the country in which these standards are being reported on. Again, I make the point that in the countries which are most affected, we have little lever, very few levers of control, and we also not in a position to understand the full impact because the disclosures are not at the source where we as stakeholders have an interest. So that's also something that also needs to put into position. The second point from that perspective, now I accept that the guidelines and so on do make some reference to, if you want, stakeholder interests and so on, but the issue is one of proximity, right? That the lever of control is distant, it's far. And the presumption in all of these rules is that the host country government has the necessary operative capacity to oversee, to evaluate, to measure, and in the second perspective, that they have the necessary economic wherewithal to enforce. Now, all of those, I would say, that are tenuous. Now, this is not in any way to undervalue the initiatives which are being taken at a larger multinational level or bigger level in the sense of reporting at the level of the company. But the point is that it's very remote. And that's a critical issue from the point of view where these standards are. They are remote relative to the people who are likely to be most affected. So that the issue of the ethical presumptions, the moral presumptions of if you want, of an interested investor who is also at the same token disinterested where economics is concerned, do not necessarily coincide. And that the nexus of control, and this is not in any way to undervalue that there are serious people who are committed to making certain that these guidelines are important, are followed, are enforced. But I make the point that the real issue is the issue of proximity. So that on the other side of the fence, what that needs to be married with, contrasted with, supported by, buttressed, has to do with what is taking place in the country of origin, the investee country. I think that is a specific issue as well. And in the same way, I know that the reporting standards are still under development, but in the same way that we have segmentation or segmented reporting for earnings, we need to have that sort of level of segmentation as well. No doubt the standards do take some of that into consideration, but the issue once again is that is occurring in a report which is being presented in a boardroom, a general meeting, or whatever it is, very far, very remote from the countries which are going to be affected. So there's also a more important interest, and that needs to be cultivated in host country jurisdictions as well at two levels. At the level of NGOs, at the level of the organizations which are going to have an interest and a stake in terms of what is taking place in individual countries, and at the level in terms of the state regulator. Now, most times we're talking about initiatives at the level of reporting, which are far removed from state intervention. But given, and I speak here wearing the hat of an investee country, where we don't have the necessary levers of control to control what multinational organizations are doing, and the corporations in many instances have budgets which are far bigger than national country budgets. And in those circumstances, the degree of influence is weak. The degree of reporting in terms of understanding is also weak. And that the dichotomy, as correctly pointed out by the professor early on, between the issue of COVID, the effect of COVID, and the issue of the wider issue of climate change, is also the economic realities under which many countries survive, particularly investing countries, without which, and without the investment that is coming from direct foreign investment, they will have great difficulties in terms of maintaining standards of living, or alternatively increasing or improving the overall level of standard of living. So that the issue of capacity to influence, to ensure that these standards are not only maintained, but the word is not maintained, but are instituted in a way that makes sense to the domestic environment, is also something I think that requires greater host country involvement and some degree of regulation. Now, standards and international standards by definition do have some sort of regulatory power, but I make the point that it's distance. It's not related to the source. It's not related to the countries in which these changes are taking place. So that one complements, one accepts that these are positive initiatives, and one also understands that let's put it this way, accounting standards have undergone a significant degree of change over the last 40 years. And even with that, and with those changes, there's still the issue of relevance and whether they give a true and fair view, as distinct from a true and correct view, or alternatively a good view at all. Are we agreeing on the same first principles? Well, we are in the same position, and we need to bring the same level of discussion to ESG standards and the issue of moral money. Thank you.
Shelly, you're still on mute.
Thank you. Yes, I'm having a bit of technical difficulties there, but thank you very much, Mr. Browne, for your insight. And indeed, that is an interesting perspective again in relation to the investee countries and their inability or relative inability to insist on moral money and insist on ESG. So I'm going to give Professor Malan an opportunity to respond to the various issues raised by the panelists. We have one perspective espoused by Mr. Browne in relation to the investee countries, and especially those in the Caribbean and across developing countries that rely on foreign direct investment, especially where the investors, as Mr. Browne rightly pointed out, might have budgets that far exceed our national budgets. And we also have the view, on the other hand, of companies. How do you attract investment by formulating a proper ESG plan with KPIs, etc. Professor Malan, do you have any comments or further insight into these issues?
Yes, thanks very much, Shelly, and thank you to both panelists for their great comments. I agree with what you've said, and I will try and just respond very briefly to a couple of the things that you mentioned. Firstly, I think what both of you highlight is, and I also refer to that in my own presentation, is that context is always important when we look at these issues, whether it is in a developing country, in an investee country, in terms of the power relation between the multinational corporations themselves or institutional investors. One needs to look at that context and understand the power relations in order to analyze them sufficiently and to interpret them correctly. And then secondly, perspective is also important. So you referred to, Alison spoke from the company perspective. Mariano spoke briefly also about the public's perspective. And we know that in a stakeholder economy, your own views will be determined by your perspective, which means that you need to take that into account and understand how you relate to to some of the other stakeholders in the broader ecosystem. And with both of those, the other issue that I think, or the concept that is important, is materiality. So you need to try and drill down as quickly as possible to what is really important, what do people want to talk about, what are they interested in. So from the company perspective, again, I think it is fairly obvious that investors play a huge role, and legislators would play a big role in terms of their demands of the companies. So companies need to listen to what the investors want. A lot of that would then be reflected in terms of reporting requirements, where investors say, this is the type of information that we need. And we've seen that shift happening, and I think that's going to continue, that the E and the S and the G are increasingly being asked for. And that's also reflected to some extent in legislation. And we see, in international accords like the Climate Accord and others, those would be reflected as well. I think the public perspective is a little bit more tricky, because from a stakeholder perspective, if you are a corporation, it is easier to ignore the public, if I may put it as bluntly as that, perhaps at your own peril in some cases. But as opposed to the political system, where the public really has a very strong voice and can, as we've seen around the world, can have a huge impact on who governs the countries, the public, especially if the public does not own shares in the companies, their impact is much more limited. Yes, you can see trends, you can have consumer boycotts, which might be some of the most extreme ways in which the public can really let its voice be heard. But, and I think that's one of the attractive things that is also incorporated in Professor Garrett's suggestion of that national framework. If you can build into the system the public oversight, then you can really give the public a voice. And then, just in terms of where you get that information for investors, largely that would then be in the annual reports, in the integrated report, in the sustainability report to some extent. For legislators as well, even though there might be some cases where companies need to report directly to government departments in terms of emissions, etc. And again, I think the public as a stakeholder draws the short string there, because they have to rely on what they read in the news or in the media, or some of the more PR related reports or information that gets put out by corporations. And the concept of integrated reporting, which is different from the integrated report. In other words, reporting by companies as a consistent way across the board, from the annual report to newspaper ads, to television ads, to brochures, to communication with NGOs, etc. If that is consistent and honest, whether it is externally assured or not is a different debate. I don't have strong feelings about that. But if it is honest and transparent, then at least the public will get decent information that that they can use. And then in just a final comment in terms of coming back to the context, if you are in a particular country like the Caribbean, obviously there would be specific environmental, social, and governance issues that different stakeholders would be interested in. And I think some of the reporting standards that we see, like the GRI, would make provision for that, and that's where materiality comes in again. So if you talk about human rights, for example, you talk about the impact of climate change, you would expect those companies to provide you with information that would be applicable and relevant for you in the region. If it's not there, then you have to ask for it, and then we come back to that those power relations, where the more powerful you are, the easier it's going to be to get the information.
Thank you, Professor Malan, for that response. I'm just going to invite those participants who are on the call. Just remember that you can use the raise hand button if you want to be involved in the discussion. I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate because the concept of moral money brings together two very alliterative terms, moral and money. And from a biblical standpoint, I recall hearing or reading a verse or something, you know, you hear it in the church all the time, you know, it's either God or money. So is the concept of moral money an oxymoron? Is it something that really doesn't make sense in the grand scheme of things? Professor Malan, I don't know if you would like to respond to that.
Well, I would say certainly not. I think that, you know, when we talk about ethics and ethical values and morality within a business environment, you talk about the application of existing values. And, you know, there is the common phrase that's used quite often when we talk about responsible business, is that it's not about what you do with your money, it's how you make your money. And certainly, you know, the way in which you operate as a company, the way in which you are governed, the way you relate to your stakeholders, all of those things could be subjected to questions about morals and ethics. And therefore, the profits that you make, you know, could also be described as, you know, as dirty money or clean money or moral money. I mean, there are many different concepts that we can use. And of course, again, you know, this can be dealt with at many different levels. And if we think about the high level sort of systemic issues at the moment, you know, ultimately it comes down to ideological debates as well. So to put it in very crude terms, if you are a socialist and you look at a purely capitalist country, then you're going to say, you know, all profit is evil, and therefore, you know, you'll have some of those debates that you can never really solve. The one interesting thing about our current situation is, and you know, the other term that we often hear at the moment is that of the Great Reset, to say, is it possible as a result of the pandemic and the way in which the whole global economy has been forced to, you know, to stand still to some extent, for us to pause and to say, is there a way in which we can make the rules a little bit more fair, a little bit more ethical, so that everybody can participate in the system in an ethical way. But certainly moral money, it's not a choice between the two. How you make profits inside, you know, a market economy would depend on whether you apply ethical principles, whether you do it in an honest, transparent way that respects the dignity of others, that respects human rights, etc., etc.
And so I have another question in the absence of anybody else asking anything at the moment. But so is there any fear or concern that in light of the increased regulatory requirements for operating in business, whether it is you know, so you know your client. I operate in the financial services industry, so there's a lot of that know your client, all of these compliance related, AML compliance related issues. And then for those other types of regulated business, there are going to be regulatory requirements. There's always accounting and reporting requirements on that. And is there any concern that there is or that companies will reach a point of fatigue in terms of all of these different standards that they have to meet, especially companies in developing countries? And again, I raise that just because I'm from Barbados, from the Caribbean, operate in the B.V.I. The standard fatigue, where there is this continuous requirement and broadening and lengthening and of requirements and reporting for companies to be considered good companies, especially where there is still a requirement as a business to do business and to make money. Is there any concern in the international community and certainly in the academic community about fatigue?
And I wonder if we could ask Professor Garrett to also come into that question, because I find that to be very intriguing, Shelly, you know, in terms of understanding the impact of all these legislative changes that, you know, it's hitting our region. And as that is so true, I really like this perspective that Mariano brought in terms of really, you know, so a lot of what we may want to see happen as stakeholders for our region, you know, how do we ensure that our voice is heard as well, so that the reporting requirement there is we are able to influence, and it works for our benefit as well. So, Camille, I see that you have your your audio unmuted. Did you want to make a contribution while we give Professor Garrett a second to gather his thoughts to answer?
Yes, I did. Because I think as we look at our Caribbean situation and morality, we also need to bear in mind how much more in terms of restrictions are placed on us as Caribbean nations. To open a bank account here in Jamaica is so much more difficult than to open one in New York. When they're holding us to account for money laundering, you have banks in Europe who are convicted of laundering billions of dollars. I mean, more than we could ever even begin to think of passing through our shores. So this whole question of morality, whose morality? And is it morality that is just and even? And to the point that was made earlier, that the more powerful you are, the easier it is to get information. I think as Caribbean countries, we perhaps need to band together more when it comes to those investor companies, because of course the nature of capital is they're going to go where they will get the best terms, and they will use their power to say, this is what we want. Whereas if all the investee countries got together to say, no, we're not going to allow you to cause us ecological harm, then we have more power in terms of pushing back.
That is an excellent observation. So yes.
Could I just make a comment on what Camilla said before we hand over for the other question? Because I think the point she's made is very good. And what I have seen coming at it from working on projects in developing countries where you've had people coming in as international experts who have kind of taken what they see as the best practices from other places in the world, and they've then put them together as the regulations for a very immature economy. And the hodgepodge of regulations they've put together, you would never find the US or the UK or one of the mature economies agreeing to, because they just don't work really. And I think that's, you know, I've seen this a lot, and I think it's one of the challenges that for developing countries to actually really, rather than being pressured into taking some of these things, to actually think about it and push back and say, well, this won't work. You know, if you impose this regulation on us, we won't be able to open our bank doors tomorrow, or we won't be able to run our insurance companies because we just can't operate under this level. And if you push back, you know, if you look at the US, they're not even at Basel II, and yet they're imposing Basel 3, Basel 3 point whatever onto 4, onto a lot of very, very immature markets. So I think the level playing field is not there as far as some of the regulations that we're being asked to live up to. And I don't know, again, Professor Garrett and Daniel may have comments on that.
Well, let me make 2 brief comments, and then I'd be really interested to hear what Bob has to say about this as well. But firstly, on the issue of whose values, I think, you know, that opens up a Pandora's box of, you know, a lot of different ethical theories and interpretations, and it really is about, you know, trying to straddle that divide between relativism and absolutism. And the best answer that I've seen for that would be to say that I think there is general agreement about some fundamental values, or what some people call intrinsic values, things like respect for human dignity, respect for human rights, transparency, accountability, etc., that should apply everywhere in the world, regardless of your local context, but then that there should be some flexibility in terms of how that is interpreted and managed within a particular environment. So, I mean, it is a solution, but it is a difficult one as well, because then you need to start interpreting local context in order to come up with solutions. Secondly, in terms of fatigue, I absolutely agree. I think that, there is, similar to what we've seen in the reporting environment, corporations are getting increasingly frustrated with increasing demands in terms of compliance and regulation. And certainly, I think the way to simplify that would be the way to go. But the problem there is that we want to simplify in a world that is getting increasingly complex. And the way to do that would be, again, to try and move away from compliance tick box regulations to principle-based regulations. And in that way, you could potentially get the code of 200 pages down to a code of 2 pages, but you're never going to get it down to 2 paragraphs. So you always need to, to make sure that there is still sufficient detail in there, but that you guide based on principles and not in terms of tick boxes.
If I may make a comment, just a follow-up from Alison. And I have to say, with respect,
Mariano, we're barely hearing you again.
All right. And I have to say, this is with respect, all respect to you, Professor Malan, about absolutism and relativism. I mean, we have some very practical examples of it. The OEC guidelines, for example, with regard to tax compliance, effectively a top-down imposition, if you want, by developed countries that effectively have stymied, in many instances, how smaller economies operate. And quite frankly, it is an imposition, and it's an imposition to which we should strenuously object. Because whilst it may be founded on all these fundamental principles and so on, quite frankly, how it's operated is quite differential. Right? So that, for example, Ireland is treated very differently, as is Liechtenstein or any of the other countries, from the way Caribbean countries have been blacklisted. And that works quite across quite a number of issues, including, for example, the issue with regard to anti-terrorism and money laundering and everything else that works with that. We can't be, the Caribbean cannot be a money launderer by definition, because we don't have any US dollars in the Caribbean. It operates all in New York, in accounts in New York, in London, and all the major money center countries. But we are the ones that get blacklisted. So I don't agree with that at all. Quite the opposite. I do think that in many instances, what we consider about absolutism, or a body of rules on which we could agree, unfortunately, in reality, when they are applied in manners which hurt other countries or smaller countries. I have some serious disagreements with that. So whilst I accept there's a point of view that there may be some general principles, I have to say that those general principles and how they're applied vary greatly in practice. And I've actually seen some projects which, as Alison correctly pointed out, those principles, for example, if they were used, you wouldn't get any investment anywhere. And I've seen some, I mean, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, for example, at least one plant literally disappear on the basis of regulations, which were cobbled together, set of regulations that came from other countries that just simply totally impractical. So I would put that one on the table as well.
Well, just very briefly, perhaps you misunderstood me. I don't think we are in disagreement. I mentioned both absolutism and relativism as the two extremes. I wouldn't support any one of those two. And I mentioned, one example to try and get perhaps a compromise between them, to say that there are certain universal values, ethical values that one could argue should apply everywhere. But certainly just to have one set of rules that you force down on weaker regions or weaker countries, I would agree with you, is unacceptable.
Professor Garrett?
Oh, right. Yeah, many thoughts around that. This particular part of the conversation started around ethics fatigue, or fatigue in relation to compliance. Yes, and I think that it'll always be so. But in relation to emerging countries, I find it very interesting that I think the argument is shifting a bit now, rather than imposing what has already been agreed, usually, but not exclusively, by Western countries, sometimes by China. We're beginning to see a bit of a fight back with some of the countries saying, regardless of what you're trying to impose on us, we wish to think about having a license to operate imposed on you. So this is a smaller country saying to a bigger country, it's all very well you coming in and wonderful if you bring some employment and all the rest of it, but this notion of license to operate, and particularly a time-based license to operate, is beginning to emerge at the moment. And I'm not sure how it's going to work out, but it's certainly around. And people are saying, actually, you know, you will have to obey the law of our country as much as we will obey what you may call international law, but it's not international law, it's what you're imposing on us. So there's quite a fight building there. And then another aspect is this universalism. It's interesting, if you look at the 7 duties of the company director in the UK Act, section 171 there, the key bits of it are independence of thought, which most people love the idea of, but have no idea how to make that work around a boardroom table. But then the next bits are quite interesting in ethical terms. It's each director and each board to be able to show a duty of care in relation to their decision making process. So being careful and diligent in what they do. And that's a very interesting one because it's on the edge of ethics and such like. And then in the 171 Act, it goes into then the issues of declaring interests, third-party transactions, and those sorts of things. So there are some interesting issues around there. I wrote in Stop the Rot a couple of years ago. I wrote a chapter on values because I was getting so messed up by it. And I came out with a little historical research, what people were talking about in terms of values, what goes wrong, and then what goes right. So it's very crude, but it's good and bad values. And the good values were around humility, which was the antidote to pride, kindness, which was the antidote to envy, abstinence, which was the antidote to gluttony, chastity, which was the antidote to lust, patience, which was the antidote to wrath, and liberality, which was the antidote to greed, and then followed up by diligence as the antidote to sloth. And the reason I mention those is because I was quite surprised at the response I had from all sorts of people around the world on that, pointing out that what I just put down on paper there was basically an outline of the ethics, that is the relationship between one person and another, as expounded in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it's very interesting that there do seem to be some fairly deep notions. I'm not sure I call them fundamentals, but there are some very deep notions on how we actually deal with each other, which at the moment are rarely expressed at board level. Our next speaker is going to be Professor Mike Mainelli, who's now the Sheriff of the City of London. And in 2 years' time, there is, subject to the democratic process, a strong likelihood of him becoming the Lord Mayor of London. And one of the bases of the Shrievalty, the sheriffs and the Lord Mayor, and the livery companies which still exist in London, is that on induction to these areas, you have to take a public oath. And that public oath is "my word is my bond." I've had to do that in my own companies. It's a very interesting part of an induction process, not a normal induction process for a board, but one that is very strong in personal ethical terms. And it does seem to change people's behavior if they have to stand before, literally stand before their peers and actually make that oath. So we get into some very interesting areas here. I don't have a simple solution to this, but there do seem to be some very deep spiritual emotions involved in this activity. And it's one that I'm still exploring. Not sure if that's helpful, but that's my response.
Thank you, Professor Garrett. I think that comes back to some of the comments that were made in one of the earlier panels, where the concept or the idea that it comes down to the individual director's morals, and certainly the shareholders or the owners of the business's morals. So another question that I would pose then is whether or not the concept of moral money is really more an outward manifestation of the morality, the individual morality, and then therefore the collective morality of those persons involved in the management of the company, whether it be the directors or the shareholders who appoint them.
I would bet that straight back to Daniel Malan.
Yeah, let me make one additional comment perhaps on moral money, and I'm going to bring it back to the role of the investors as well. Is that the use of the term moral money might in some cases be a misnomer, because the reason why big companies like, and I'm mentioning BlackRock just because it often comes up in conversation now, but because there now is a growing business case for ESG. And I think that is one of the reasons why the institutional investment community is embracing it in such a way. For many years, companies complained and they said, well, we're not going to do ESG because everybody except the investors asked us for that information. And now that they are asking for it, everybody sits up and take notice, and that's a good thing. But I think the reality is that in many cases, that term is used as a way in which the investment community is embracing the new reality, that now we can see the impact of climate change, we can see the impact of social unrest and inequality, and therefore we know something must be done about it. And I go back to that quote from the World Bank document where they said companies do that whether they want impact or not. So it's become a trend, and in that way, for that reason, I think we should still applaud it, but we should also understand that sometimes it's done not for ethical or moral reasons, but simply because that is the way in which you're going to get a bigger return on your investment.
Could I add something to what Daniel's been saying, which is, I think we also need to take into consideration the impact of the millennial generation, which is now, I believe, something around 80% of the world's workforce. And certainly in some of the developing countries, it's the majority of the workforce. And I think what they've been doing and their views on whether it's environmental climate issues, whether it's on social issues, that their own wanting to have an impact, a wider impact on the world around them, I think is also driving some of this, because the pressure that is now coming on companies and the use of the internet and social media, companies have to be a lot more responsive and a lot more aware of what they're doing and the impact it's going to have. Because if they're not, their reputations can be destroyed by a tweet or a WhatsApp message. So I think, you know, the impact, you know, of the younger generations are driving, I think, some of this conversation that we're having to have. You know, I wonder if their focus had been elsewhere, whether we would be as far along in this conversation possibly than we are at the moment. And it's going to be interesting as they start getting onto boards and taking up senior management positions, you know, how much more this conversation is just going to start happening at boards because of their interests. I don't know, Daniel, what you're nodding there, so I don't know what your views are on that.
Well, I don't have any strong views, but I agree with you. And I think, you know, that's one of the ways in which we see diversity coming on boards and how new generation is having an impact on the way in which stakeholders think about different issues and put pressure on companies or on governments to do things differently. So I do agree with you that I think it is one of the big drivers, and it's going to continue to be alongside other, you know, systemic changes that we are seeing, some of them more negative in terms of inequality, for example, that's on the rise, or climate change. But the new sort of upcoming generation, I would agree with you fully, is going to play a big role.
Would you say then, Professor, or open it up to the rest of the panel, that right now a lot of the big companies in particular who have adopted this view of ESG or adopted ESG principles are doing it, or what we would say in the Caribbean, playing a bit of eye service? They're doing it because it looks good at the moment and everybody's eyes are on them, and it is good for profits. And perhaps that's why I think you mentioned in your presentation that in the midst of COVID, some investors had deprioritized ESG because of the COVID situation. And so because it's not something that they feel and truly identify with, it is easy to relapse into bad habits. So we look forward to the next, you know, few years when the millennials have taken over the boards and are driving this from a place of deep passion and acceptance, rather than sort of just doing what they're told to do by, you know, the wider public through social media and through other types of.
Well, let me say, I mean, first of all, I think that the idea that you are, it comes back to what I quoted Ed Freeman saying, that we should get away from saints or sinners. So many companies will use this term, enlightened self-interest, and for 99% of cases, that would be an accurate description, where you can say, I do this because I'm going to make more profit, and it's also the right thing to do. But there are cases where, for example, you know, if you do harm the environment, or you make an investment where you know human rights will be negatively impacted, where you do have to make a choice between the two. And that is why I think it is important to maintain that distinction, but it's not a choice. You don't have to choose for either the one or the other. Somebody, a professor from Notre Dame in the US, referred to it as the need to distinguish, but not to separate. So we understand both, but we don't say you have to choose between the two. So for me, that would be the most important thing, you know, to try and interpret what companies are doing at the moment. So yes, they do things because they feel the pressure, because investors are asking them for it. They also do it in many cases because they are fully committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, or because they are committed to, you know, a world where the common good or respect for human dignity will be reflected also in business practices. So the business world, even in one country, is too complex to say this is how it is. We're always going to have the mix of some companies, that continue in, with irresponsible behavior and simply saying that we'll do whatever is legal. But the trend, I think, is certainly towards more ethical business, towards the E and the S and the G, with the E or the 6 capitals, whatever model you want to apply. I think it is moving in the right direction, and I think we should support and applaud that.
If I can add, I mean, I think one of the things I found when I've been doing workshops with companies, particularly in Africa, is that many of them are doing ESG activities because it makes business sense, not because anybody's insisting that they should do them, but they don't actually call them ESG activities or even recognize that they are ESG activities until somebody starts having the conversation, some of the conversations that we've been having today. So, I mean, I agree with what Daniel says, is some of this is, it just makes good business sense and they're doing it without realizing you can put a name tag on it. Others, there is, and I mentioned the term greenwashing, and there are many, many examples of social or environmental activities that are put forward as such, and then when you start digging into them a bit, or the press dig into them, you actually find that there's nothing behind them. They've just been done for a PR exercise. So I think, even within the same companies, sometimes you can find examples of both. So I think, some companies will do good things in one area, they'll do the greenwashing in another. And I think it's trying to get, the recognition that this does make good business sense. And then as long as you're not, I'm not a great one for regulation. I think we've had regulations around for thousands of years to do with murder and theft, and it's still not stop them from happening. And I think really what you need to do is to get people to understand that these things are good for them from the point of view, or good for their businesses. And if they're going to make profit or they're going to make money, and there's a balance that they're helping society, they're helping the environment as well. I mean, I think that's where a lot of the focus should be, rather than necessarily bringing in regulations. I was very disappointed. I think it's KPMG were doing about every two or 3 years a survey to say, why are people doing, in those days it was corporate social responsibility activities and corporate social responsibility reporting. And they were coming out with ethical considerations, brand, employee recruitment, all of these things. And then suddenly 1 year, the response was, it's mandatory. We've got to do it. There are now regulations to do it. And I often feel then, when it's been regulated, that people tend to go towards boilerplate reasons or boilerplate presentations of things, rather than when it's a voluntary, they tend to think more about it. I don't know, I haven't had a chance to read it, but the FRC in the UK have just put out I don't know if Bob and Daniel, whether you've seen this, their corporate reporting for 2020, particularly around in the UK, the new requirement under section 172 of the Companies Act to actually take stakeholder views into consideration. And I kind of, whether it was reading the headline, got the impression that they weren't as impressed as they thought they might be on some of the disclosures. I do know I've looked at some in some of the multinationals, and there do seem to be pages and pages of descriptions about who are their stakeholders and some of the things that they're doing for them. So I'm going to read with interest, probably tomorrow now, as it's very late where I am, what the FRC conclusions were. I don't know, Bob and Daniel, if you've had a chance to look at them, but you know.
Shall I comment?
Yeah. Yes, please.
I mean, I haven't had a good look at them yet, but I'm underwhelmed by them. I don't think they've moved things very far. But then I think it's a case of the Financial Reporting Council, I don't think they really read Section 172 before they commented on it. I mean, I'm being slightly facetious, but in 2006, when it took 8 years to pass that act through both houses of Parliament, it mentions the whole of ESG effectively. It mentions effect on the environment, on employees, on supply lines. It mentions the impact on local communities and on the economic environment. So it's all in one page on 172. So I'm not quite sure why they have gone so big on that at the moment. But then when I was giving my talk in the Houses of Parliament back in March, I did actually challenge the audience of 100 people if any of them could list what was on Section 172, but particularly could any of them list any of the 7 duties of a director in Section 171. 2 people managed to get 2. 2 people out of 100 managed to get 2. And afterwards, I had a group of concerned MPs come up to me, about 6 of them, to say, this is really embarrassing, but yes, we are legislators who passed that act. But if you look around you, there's 100 people. We think only 6 of them were in Parliament in 2006. We've never had the act put in front of us. We don't know these sections. There is no induction process for an MP or a member of the House of Lords. We all have great opinions on these things, but you've just made us very embarrassed by the fact that we don't know what we're talking about. And so one of the things we've offered as soon as COVID is over is to start some very simple induction sessions for legislators on these very issues. Yeah. Strange, but true.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point. I know I was asked when the South Sudanese government was being put together to give them an awareness training on what corporate governance was and how it fitted into some of the other laws. And I think it's something that is missing in a lot of governments, that they don't understand what this terminology is, the impact it has.
But they do have very firm views on it all the same.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Well, thank you to the panel. Thank you to Professor Garrett as well for your insightful comments. This has been a very wide-ranging discussion, I think, of a topic that when I first read it, I had more questions than answers. And now I feel like I have a better understanding of the concept of moral money and all of the, well, not all, but certainly some of the implications for business. I want to thank Professor Malan for your presentation. It's certainly food for thought. I want to thank Alison for your contribution as well as Mariano. And I'm going to hand over now to Kamala so that she can wrap up and do the rest of the session so that we can finish almost on time.
Shelly, can I, before you do that, can I just take 1 minute to just make one final point, if you don't mind? If somehow I created the impression that I believe developing countries should be held to higher standards than developed countries, I apologize, because that's certainly not what I argued. I fully agree with the point that that as Bob said, perhaps it should be the other way around, and those that the bar should be set at a very high level for companies coming in. And just to add to that, I think that's where the need for collective action would come in as well, because if one country does that, but the neighboring country doesn't, then it becomes very easy for big multinationals to move around. And I think the point was made earlier as well, specifically in your region, that there could also be some scope for collective action. I think that could be very valuable. And finally, just the point about COVID-19 that I didn't address earlier. The point that I made was that if companies believe that COVID-19 is not an ESG issue, and they say we are deprioritizing ESG because of COVID-19, they miss the point that this is an ESG issue. And it means that they think about ESG only as the 200-page questionnaire that they should fill in and tick all the boxes. And I think that is a very important challenge for all companies to understand.
Thank you, Shelly. Thank you, Professor Malan. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Mariano. This has been a really great session as well.